This talk is called Ethical Money, the Fiduciary Issue, and I'm offering this lecture as a contribution to the President of Ireland's Ethics Initiative. And in his words, it's to bring ethics out of the ivory tower and the pulpit and into the market square. And I don't think we can get anything closer to the market square than the very issue of money itself. So we're going to look at money. But let's go back to ethics. Ethics is one of those old philosophical and theological words that, together with value, good, truth, fiduciary, and grace, have fallen into disuse in the modern world. As President Higgins clearly understands, a resurrection of these old words is sorely needed in today's discourses. And yet, surprisingly, many of these very words are still to be found in the language of the money economy. Responding in turn to President Higgins's call to query some of the unquestioned assumptions of the status quo in order to help chart a way out of the economic, ecologic, and humanitarian crises currently plaguing our world and threatening not only human culture, but human existence itself. Our inquiry turns to an understanding of the talisman, the indentured fetish of the primitive savage, which is the most ancient manifestation of money, and which the ex-nihilo double entry, ex-nihilo out of nothing, so the ex-nihilo double entry of bank money is the modern equivalent. I have two Greek people here tonight, so they can confirm that from the Greek telesma, meaning complete, a talisman is an object that completes another object and makes it whole. The simplest talisman consisted of a split stone or a split stick. Whose interlocking halves, when accepted, like these two here, if he offers her, he puts this one close to his heart and offers her the other one, there's an awful lot contained in this. Right? It implied a contract or a bond. Right? Once the halves were matched or trued, the contract was incontestable. No one could argue that they didn't match. This truth was universal. Everyone could see that. In isolation, each half of the split object, each bearing silent witness to the contract, became enchanted with a supplementary spirit. It became a fetish, much like the fetish Marx found in the commodity, but this fetish was much older. This was the money fetish, and it probably marks the point of origin of the symbolic human domain, the point of origin of human culture itself. We'll put it back on its altar, because this is a sacred object. The dominant ethical ideology today is based on our Judeo-Christian tradition, in which the logical relation between the good and evil is that evil is primary and the good, being derived from evil, is secondary. Replacing the terms good and evil with credit and debt, this ethical ideology finds its echo in the modern money economy, where new money is only ever created as a debt on society, and redemption of debt can only be achieved by individual hard work. In his pamphlet, Ethics, an essay on the understanding of evil, the French philosopher and mathematician Alain Badiou inverts this logical relation and asserts the primacy of the good, and only then the risk of evil as the perversion of the good. And he identifies three such perversions: simulacrum, or fidelity to a false image of the good; as betrayal, giving up on the good in favor of one's private interest; and disaster, through forcibly symbolizing what cannot be symbolized. The contention to be argued in this lecture is that risks of evil or debt can be found in each of the three forms of book entry bank money: real money, fiduciary money, and ex-nihilo money. The question is tackled as to whether non-pathological ethical money is ever possible, or whether money will forever be the root of all evil. However, we cannot come to terms with the perversions of the money economy without understanding how money itself is created. So this is our first task. Money creation. In the economics textbooks, money is defined with three contradictory functions: as a store of wealth, as a medium of exchange, and as a unit of account. These contradictory functions have stimulated much argument as to whether money gets its value from the commodity form of the material, gold or silver, from which the money token is made, or whether money is a social construct, getting its value from the sponsorship of the sovereign power. Nowadays, this argument has been resolved by the actual electronic practices of the banks themselves, so that it is only today that we can understand the essence of what money is, and indeed what it always was. Money is a social construct. It is created by the bank as a book entry, and it finds its physical embodiment only in electrons stored as digits in the computer of the issuing bank. It cannot be converted into gold. Without a physical dimension, money can only be expressed as a pure number. All new money is created today in the form of a book entry in the bank. Specifically, it is created in the form of a double entry of two equal numbers on the debit and credit sides of the bank's account. Prompted by a request from one of the parties to a real economic transaction, the ex-nihilo double entry opens the line of credit that can be drawn down by the requesting party. It also keeps account of the transaction. The ex-nihilo double entry therefore consists of units of account. created ex nihilo and resting on both sides of the bank's account, the double entry amounts to nothing in itself. It is what Adam Smith referred to as an empty vehicle. This unit of account is the same unit that we all use for counting on our fingers. It is a pure number. Okay? So here is our first possible source of confusion. Real money is expressed as a pure number, and the unit of account representing the line of credit is a pure number. All of the wishful thinking in the world will not convert a pure number into real money. The type of money that represents a store of wealth, or that is acceptable in exchange for real goods and services in the economy. When the line of credit opened by the ex nihilo double entry is drawn down into an individual's credit account, having paid her wages, for example, then this number enters a new phase of its existence and converts to real money representing a store of wealth. Or more subtly, when it is drawn down by the state to create the fiduciary or nominal money issue, then again the number enters a new phase and becomes acceptable as a medium of exchange for real goods and services. The completion of a real economic transaction, as recorded by entering the number into an individual user's account, thereby converts the pure number representing the unit of account in the bank's account into a pure number representing real money in the individual's credit account. The completion of a transaction in the real economy provides the alchemy required for Adam Smith's empty vehicle to acquire its load, to become real money. The ex nihilo double entry, while amounting to nothing in itself, provides an opening in the line of credit to possibilities. And in this regard, it is but the modern equivalent of the split stick, the split stone of the primitive savage, worthless in itself, but full of possibilities. So let's take a close look at this money fetish. The money fetish. In our everyday lives, we meet examples of positive and negative shapes, such as the outside threads on a bolt, the inside threads on a nut, such as the male and female electrical connections, and of course, in the split stick that has been cleaved lengthwise, where the irregularities of the grain structure on one side are the negative of the irregularities of the grain structure on the other side. Positive and negative. The most primitive method of taking account is by tally counting. Shepherds would notch a stick for each member of their flock going out to pasture in the morning. In the evening, by checking the notches to the sheep as they were being penned for the night, the shepherd could check if he had lost or gained any during the day, and take appropriate action. So with tally counting, there is not yet a concept of number. There is simply a one-to-one correspondence between the sheep and the marks on the stick. From the most modern theory of number, definition of number, requires the sectioning of its matter, here's its matter, sectioning into two parts called the form and the residue. A number is defined with respect to the form. The negative of that number is defined with respect to the residue. Recombining the form with the residue restores the original matter. That's our most modern number theory of what a number is. From the vantage point of this most modern theory of number, we can only now assert retrospectively that the birth of numbers took place with the simple gesture of cleaving the notched stick along its length, where each half of the stick was the unambiguous counterfoil of the other half. No one could argue with that. I think, and I'm going to assert this, that the birth of money took place with the same gesture and at much the same time. So number and money are inextricably linked. So once the flock of sheep was to be put up for sale, the split stick had the potential to become a pre-literate form of an indentured contract, with each half reflecting either a debt or a purchase obligation. One half of the stick, called the stock, was left at home to account for the stock, and it played the role of the conventional tally stick. The other half, called the foil, was brought to market to relieve the burden of bringing the whole of the flock. The foil, being found to be an socially acceptable representation of the real stock in the purchase obligation, thereby gained a non-material or ideal supplement, and so became a fetish, a thing in which the social contract or bond between the parties to the transaction could be represented. It became money. So let's look at one of the types of money, fiduciary money and its perversion. When the sovereign power issues new money into the economy, this is referred to as the fiduciary or nominal money issue. James Tobin, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1981, but nonetheless was one of the good guys, described the fiduciary issue as follows. The community's wealth now has two components: the real goods accumulated through past real investment, and fiduciary or paper goods manufactured by the government from thin air. Of course, the non-human wealth of such a nation really consists only of its tangible capital. But as viewed by the inhabitants of the nation individually, wealth exceeds the tangible capital stock by the size of what we might term the fiduciary issue. This is an illusion, but only one of the many fallacies of composition which are basic to any economy or society. The illusion can be maintained unimpaired as long as the society does not actually try to convert all of its paper wealth into goods, and he means simultaneously. Tobin's fiduciary issue illusion is nothing of the sort. It is the assumption that the fiduciary issue is created from thin air. Ex-nihilo, that is the illusion. The fiduciary issue is the monetary embodiment, the objectified image of the symbolic human domain. Its value arises from human existence and social human practice in its historical entirety. While fiduciary wealth does not exist as physical wealth on top of the real assets of the community, individuals can behave as if fiduciary wealth was real, because at an individual level, money is readily exchangeable for physical assets. Fiduciary wealth, therefore, has a strong resemblance to Hegel's spiritual substance, something that cannot be reduced to an individual's real wealth, but yet cannot exist without it. Being an unearned supplement to the physical wealth of the human community, requiring no extra individual effort or work above that required simply to exist as a community of human beings, the fiduciary issue, once spent into the economy and not issued as an interest-bearing debt, has many of the features of the religious concept of grace. If the monetary authority regulates the fiduciary issue through taxation and spending, so that the purchasing power of the money token is not compromised, then fiduciary money is ethical money. However, currently throughout the global economy, when a sovereign state requests an issue of new money from the central bank, the bank gives the state a line of credit and in turn records this as an interest-bearing debt in the form of government bonds. The banking sector has an effective monopoly of the supply of money to the sovereign state, with the result that in order to have a growing money supply, the public must carry an overall burden of a faster growing interest-bearing debt. So issuing the fiduciary money as interest-bearing debt resembles the religious concept of original sin, as the indelible stain on the soul of every child who comes into the world. Privatizing the fiduciary issue and issuing it as interest-bearing debt is unethical, as it totalizes the denial of the social human source of its value, and it totalizes the betrayal of the fiduciary trust of the community. In denying the spiritual substance of humanity, it unleashes a savage, destructive nihilism. It is evil. Let's look at another type of money, real money, and its perversion. Consider the payments of a wages bill by a firm. The firm requests a line of credit from the bank for the payment. The bank opens the line of credit by entering its two equal numbers on the debit side and the credit side of its balance sheet. At the instant the wages are paid, the number on the bank's debit side gets drawn into the credit side of the worker's accounts, and the number on the bank's credit side gets drawn down into the debit side of the firm's account, and the firm takes possession of the new goods. The wage and the goods are but two faces of the same identical object. At this phase of its existence, the number in the worker's credit account, the wage, is a store of wealth. It is real money whose face value is honored by society at large when it is proffered for purchases in the economy. the workers have earned their bank deposits in exchange for the new goods that they have produced over the relevant period, and which are now held by the firm in order to be sold on the products market. When the workers spend their money deposits in the products market, they obtain the real content of their deposits, goods and services. In this manner, as the workers' deposits get spent, the firm recovers them and uses them to reimburse the bank for its debt. Both the new real money created and the newly created physical goods are consumed in the exchange process, since typically, at the end of the month, the worker's purse is empty and her larder is empty. The firm's warehouse is empty and its debts are paid. There is a closed money loop between the bank, the firm, and the workers, triggered by the production of the new goods. Used in this manner, real money remains true to the social contract that money obtained for today's goods will purchase equivalent goods tomorrow. It is ethical money. However, it is worth taking a closer look at the firm's debt, as recorded in its debit account, which contains a number equal to the sum of the prices of the physical goods that have yet to be sold in the warehouse. It would be a big stretch of the imagination to call this number real money, albeit in a negative embodiment. When physical output is expressed in the form of a negative number or debt, the realizable money value of the very mortal and perishable goods against which the debt is incurred cannot always match the numerical value of the debt. A positive physical quantity, 2 loaves of bread, represents positive wealth that can be seen and touched. But minus 2 loaves of bread is a negative magnitude with no physical dimension. It is a pure negative number. As such, it can only play the role of a unit of account to keep track of the repayments of the debt in real money as the sale of the goods progresses. So, unlike the number in the worker's credit account, which represents real money, the number in the firm's debit account remains in the form of a unit of account. However, if instead the debt is treated as the negative of real money, whose total amount remains constant, irrespective of what happens to the goods, then ethical hazards arise and enter into the economic sphere. Treated as if it is real money that never has to be trued with the underlying asset for which the debt was incurred in the first place, the debt achieves immortality in the classic Aristotelian sense. And it leads to the pitfall where the relationship between the money token and the underlying goods can become substituted for the social bond between the parties to the transaction. Take the scenario, take the scenario of where a customer visits a baker's shop and purchases a loaf of bread. After the transaction is completed, she inadvertently leaves the loaf on the counter when she exits the shop. On returning to the shop the next day, she would be highly offended to be offered the self-same, now stale loaf, and would rightly demand a fresh equivalent loaf or a refund. Her assumption or unwritten contract with the baker is that he should gracefully make allowance for her human error, and that for her money, the value of which had remained intact overnight, she was entitled to the same goodness as yesterday. i.e. to today's bread today, not yesterday's bread today. However, if the baker gracelessly insists, but that was the loaf of bread you bought, we're forced to do a double take because his position is plausible, until we realize that he has substituted the abstract one-sided relationship between the money token and the loaf of bread for the concrete, multifaceted social relationship, the bond between himself and his customer to supply for her money today's bread today. A promise, it's even written on his bread. If the baker maintains his one-sided perspective, which amounts to the fact that his attention is now diverted to making money and not bread, we will quickly find that the goodness of his bread will become perverted. Glass powder will be added to enhance the whiteness. E-numbers will be added to ensure a long shelf life, delivering last week's bread today in full betrayal of his promise. The perversion of the good, or goods, produced by the baker is an example of what Plato referred to as a simulacrum, a false likeness that reproduces so exactly our experience of the real world that we cannot discern the difference between the good and its imitation. The overall impossibility of treating debt as real money and not as a unit of account that is regularly trued to its underlying asset does not imply that it cannot be trued in some individual cases. For instance, the successful sale of the daily bread at the anticipated price would mean that the baker could clear his debts. And indeed, there could also be individual cases where the physical stock actually increased above the amount reflected in the debt through a purchased sheep giving birth to a lamb, for instance. However, once the unit of account is issued into the economy as a real money debt at interest, the ability to true the unphysical debt to physical reality becomes universally impossible. Interest-bearing debts are subject to the laws of mathematics rather than physics. Unlike bread, debts do not go stale overnight and are not consumed in the process of living. On the contrary, charged at simple or compound interest, debts grow at so much % per annum by well-known mathematical laws. If Christ had invested 1 cent at 5% interest on the day he visited the money changers in the temple, rather than overturning their tables, he would by today have earned himself a solid gold sphere, 150 million times the diameter of the earth. So he could just bail us out, maybe. So the relentless process of compound interest is physically impossible, though the process of compound decrement, rot, disease, infection is physically common enough. So although negative numbers can follow the law of compound interest indefinitely, the real future output against which the immortal debt has a claim cannot grow at compound interest for long. the need to compensate for the inevitable gap between between unphysical debt and physical reality was acknowledged as far back as the Bronze Age. Farmers had often to borrow to get themselves through the lean months, while hoping that nothing would prevent them from bringing in crops that would allow them to repay their debts. In ancient times, with its risks of drought, flooding, infestation, and wars, failure to repay loans could cost farmers their land, possessions, enslavement of themselves or other family members. For millennia, the problem confronting rulers was how to prevent the destabilization that occurs when large portions of the population were forced off the land or into debtor's prison for failure to repay loans. So there developed in the Near East a tradition of clean slate edicts, which proclaimed justice, decreed redemption and righteousness by cancelling debts and restoring forfeited lands to farmers. Clean slate proclamations started in summer around 2,400 years BC and eventually became enshrined in the Hammurabi Code, a tradition that became known as the Jubilee Year. And they heralded a stable 2,000-year-long period of regular economic renewal based on freedom from debt servitude. Rome was the first society to break this tradition and not cancel its debts. The collapse of the Roman Empire is attributed to the fact that creditors got the entire economy in their debt, expropriated the land and public domain, and strangled the economy. Treating the unit of account as an interest-bearing real money debt is a total betrayal of the money contract, as it puts the interest of the issuer above the interests of society and the common good. It betrays the ethic of reciprocity enshrined in the Golden Rule that is common to all of the world's advanced religions, and it pits neighbor against neighbor, nation against nation, and denies individual sovereignty. Usury on units of account is evil. Ex-nihilo money and its perversion. This is the mortgage. When a bank issues a mortgage, it opens a line of credit with its double entry of numbers equal to the price of the house in its accounts book. Once the loan is drawn down and the house purchase is complete, the number on the bank's debit side gets entered into the credit side of the seller's account, and the number on the bank's credit side is entered into the debit side of the mortgagee's account. Unlike the case of the wages described above, where one of the drawn down entries represents real money, since no new economic output has prompted the mortgage transaction, neither of the two entries that are drawn down can represent real money in this case. In the mortgage transaction, both sides of the double entry can only remain units of account, numbers whose role is to keep account of the transaction. Yet, the new number in the seller's credit account acts as if it is real money, and it has purchasing power, which is honored by society at large. When this new number is added to the existing money supply, it leads to a general increase in prices, as the increased money supply is spread over the same real economy as before. So inflation of the money supply is the first burden that the wider society must bear as a consequence of treating this ex nihilo number as real money. As the interest-bearing debt of the mortgagee is repaid in installments over the terms of the loan, the number in his debit account is gradually reduced, and in tandem, the money amount of each installment is gradually withdrawn from the economy so that the original integrity of the money supply is restored at the final payment of the capital. Any money that is used to pay interest on this mortgage must therefore come from somewhere else in the economy. Payment of interest is therefore the second burden on the rest of the economy that arises from treating this ex nihilo number as real money. However, if it is insisted that the numbers on both sides of the ex nihilo double entry are real money and are treated as such, they can, without question, cause real activity in the economy and can create the illusion that the numbers are securities or assets. This illusion gives rise to the stock and bond markets, where these assets trigger more ex nihilo transactions, and as there is no physical stopping point, the process can continue ad infinitum. So, as well as causing inflation and extracting interest, treating the two numbers in the ex nihilo double entry of the mortgage as real money assets leads to the perpetual motion of the stock and bond market number machines that brought about the global economic meltdown in 2008. It is worth examining in detail the numbers, just look at the numbers involved in that meltdown. Under the rules of 10% fractional reserve banking, each deposit in individual users' accounts can be relent 9 more times into the economy, as if it is real money. To maximize profits, a fractional reserve bank needs to lend out as much of the deposits that it receives as it can, the only constraint being the 10% reserve rule. The banks walk a tightrope between having more central bank reserves than they need and missing lending opportunities as a result, or having fewer bank reserves than they need and risking becoming illiquid and insolvent. The implicit assumption that the government will bail out any bank that runs into financial difficulty makes it likely that the banks will choose the latter option. This is their so-called moral or ethical hazard. However, in spite of the 10% reserve rule for the high street banks, in 2004, the large investment banks such as Goldman Sachs and Merrill Lynch had asset to equity leveraging ratios of 23, equivalent to a 4% reserve. By 2007, this ratio had risen to 30, equivalent to a 3% reserve. By 2008, the Royal Bank of Scotland were operating at a 2% reserve and Lehman Brothers were down to 1%. However, the financial crisis was finally triggered by a run on the shadow banking system, which allowed private financial institutions to generate as much credit as they wanted without any reserve requirement. So that in August 2008, the entire banking system held a total of about $50 billion in actual cash reserves, while clearing trades daily of $3,000 trillion, a leveraging ratio of 60,000 per day. And each one of those transactions involved an unconditional promise to pay hard cash whenever it was asked for. Incredibly, the stock market is back in action today, with the same mountain of fictitious cash assets seeking out the next bubble. But that's only one side. In turn, interest-bearing debt is also listed as an asset by the bank, and as such, it is treated as if it has liquidity. The banks had been creating risky loans that they knew would never be repaid because the mortgage applicants weren't truly qualified to borrow as much money as they did. Many of the applicants were cynically called ninjas, no income, no job, and no assets. But the regulators and rating agencies turned a blind eye because there was a lot of money about and everyone involved seemed to be getting very rich. And indeed, a lot of economic activity was stimulated. These risky debts were chopped up into securitized bonds and sold to insurance companies, retirement funds, and foreign investors. In 2007, nearly $14 trillion worth of complex securitized products were created through this process. Financial firms that had been providing the full face value for securitized bonds got worried that those bonds might contain toxic subprime debts, so they reduced the amount of money they would lend on the bonds. When Lehman Brothers defaulted in September 2008, the downward spiral accelerated and the entire financial system crashed. It was at this point that the Federal Reserve Chairman, Ben Bernanke, stepped in to provide blanket guarantees on the financial assets of banks and shadow banks alike. This was the beginning of the impossible attempt by the governments of the world to fill the bottomless hole of bank debts by imposing austerity on their human societies that continues today. While the banks, guess what, are back in business. Bonuses are back. So we know that new ex-nihilo numbers issued at interest into the economy must be spent and will thus increase demand because the borrower would not pay interest just to have money sitting idly in his bank account. Under conditions where there is no truing of the money to the physical good that would provide feedback control, prices are bid up, since the creation of numbers can increase much faster than the rate of creation of new physical wealth. Abstract demand increasing much more rapidly than physical supply is the driving force of the stock market bubbles that have been wreaking such havoc in recent decades, from the dot-com bubble of the 90s to the construction bubble of the noughties and the current bubble in waiting in who knows, social media, health, or is it going to be construction again? We don't know yet. However, such bubbles are not new. The first recorded bubble associated with ex-nihilo double-entry banking practices was the tulip mania of the 1630s, which quickly followed the incorporation of the Bank of Amsterdam nearly 30 years earlier. The meltdown of the global economy shows that the economic system, based on the insistence that units of account are real money, has no basis in physical or economic reality. However, under the strict condition that the monetary authority removes, by appropriate taxation, the immediate flush of excess money that the mortgage injects into the economy, using the fiduciary issue as a sort of a buffer, and under the strict condition that the debt of the mortgagee is issued interest-free and in such a manner that it acts as a unit of account, following the value of the asset mortgaged, then even the numbers created in the ex nihilo double entry can be ethical money. The illusion that numbers created at the stroke of a pen can spontaneously acquire value without requiring some human sweat equity, to use the modern parlance, gives rise to the fiction that money can spontaneously beget more money, leading to Bill Gates's ultimate dream of a frictionless capitalism. When examined neutrally, the apparent burst of new economic activity created by such monies is but the grotesque negative image of the destruction of the old in the erosion of social human culture on a planet becoming depleted in turn of the means of sustaining human, animal, and plant life. The system that denies the human source of the money values leads to its own nightmarish reality, in which the frictionless motion of this ultimate dream economy is lubricated by the blood and sweat of the very human beings whose role is denied. The spiritual substance of humanity is being assaulted daily in the debasement of arts, journalism, and education, leading to an indescribable confusion in thought. It is a disaster. So let's look at tally stick money, which is a historical example of ethical money. In historical times, the first widespread use of the cleaved tally stick as money occurred in 1100 AD, when King Henry I of England issued a fiat declaring them legal tender for the payment of taxes, and they remained legal tender for the next 726 years. His action was in response to a dire economic situation when he assumed the throne. The Crusades had siphoned off most of the gold and silver that could be used as money, so he either had to borrow money at interest from the moneylenders of the day, or improvise with a system of his own. Henry created tally stick money, and as it was not borrowed from any lender, but was issued interest-free and spent into the economy, it was ethical money. The tally was a stick. We've seen them before. About 9 inches long, with each of 4 sides, about ½ an inch. On 2 of the sides, the value of the tally was carved into the wood. On the other 2 sides, the amount was printed in ink. The tally was then split in half lengthwise in a kind of religious ceremony. One half, to distinguish the halves, they left a handle on one. They called that one the stock. That went to the treasury and remained in the treasury. The other half was used to pay soldiers for their pay, farmers for wheat, armourers for armour, and labourers for their labour. This was called the foil. So later, when the tally foils, having helped circulate goods and services in the real economy, were eventually returned to the treasury for the payment of taxes, the 2 halves were matched up to prevent counterfeiting. When the sticks were true and the square cross-section was restored, the parties to the transaction were all square. To distinguish the 2 halves, the stock was made a bit longer, I've said that, and the person who cleaved the sticks or broke the sticks, guess what he was called? The broker. In merry England in the Middle Ages, the wooden tallies were used to finance agriculture, construction, and essential trades that helped people live abundant lives. During this time, a labourer could provide all the necessities for his family for a year by working 14 weeks. The rest of the time, some men worked for themselves, some studied, some fished, some helped to build the cathedrals. The great cathedrals were built with mostly unpaid voluntary labour, and they were also maintained by volunteers. The people had free time and used it to increase the wealth of the kingdom, and took pride in keeping public buildings and works of art in good shape. They also had free time for learning, which explains why many of the great universities, libraries, and centres of learning were established during the 13th century, the century when the use of the tally stick money matured and came into its most universal use and acceptance in England. The tally stick was very effective at keeping the internal English economy functioning, but external wars demanded large expenditures of gold and silver, which were the only currencies accepted internationally. By the end of the 17th century, the tallies in circulation had a monetary value of about 30 times the coined metal. However, by this time, after lengthy and costly wars in Europe, England was in debt to its international creditors. So from parliamentary democracy to capitalo-parliamentarianism. In 1694, after a series of wars with France and the Netherlands, the English government struck a deal with its international creditors. It would charter and sanction a privately controlled central bank. This so-called Bank of England immediately began loaning out at interest several times more money than it had received on deposit, using the practice of fractional reserve banking. The first loan arranged by the bank was for £1.25 million to the government, secured by a debt of direct taxation on the people. With such an abundance of money, having no requirement to be true to real production, the prices of things doubled. In only 4 years, the government debt went up from £1.25 million to £16 million. And by the mid-1700s, the government's debt to the Bank of England was 10 times more than at the start of the century. So, while modern banking practices had commenced in Amsterdam nearly a century earlier, I choose the year 1694 as the fateful year in which the sovereign fiduciary issue, having been explicitly in the sovereign's hands, was transferred into private hands and issued as interest-bearing debt, in a practice that has continued ever since in every economy across the globe. This was the year in which the privatization of the public realm became institutionalized and ushered in with a vengeance the age of wars, revolutions, and exterminations of humans by humans. The tally stick system. Once the stock was retained in the exchequer as a unit of account, and the foil was circulated as real money, was an ethical money system that worked really well. And indeed, this was the system that was the foundation of the British Empire. Yet, while there are some remnants of it in our languages, there is no knowledge of this tally money system in our collective memory. It is understood that the first shares in the Bank of England were purchased with tally sticks. However, from the outset, the Bank of England sought to undermine the tally stick system because it was money issued outside of the bank's control. By 1724, Treasury officials had ordered their use to be discontinued by the Exchequer. However, the sticks remained legal tender for the next 100 years and were not completely abolished until 1826. In 1834, there was a considerable accumulation of stocks housed in the basement of the House of Lords, when, ironically, to make space for a bankruptcy court, the instructions went out that they were to be confidentially burned in the heating furnaces being underneath the parliamentary chambers. In the frenzy of excitement at finally ridding themselves of the sticks, the stokers overloaded the furnace, overheated the copper chimney flues, which set fire to the wooden panelling, which set fire to the House of Lords, which set fire to the House of Commons. The two Houses of Parliament were reduced to ashes on the 16th of October 1834 in the biggest conflagration to occur in London since the Great Fire of 1666. Turner, the great English landscape painter, captured the burning of the Palace of Westminster on his mobile phone. He was an eyewitness. Should we interpret the burning of Parliament as an omen, signifying that the end of parliamentary democracy and the commencement of capitalo-parliamentarism lies in the denial that the physical basis of the value of the fiduciary issue is in human existence and social human practice? Capitalo-parliamentarism being the system in which the main economic decisions have already been made, and parliamentary democracy is reduced to trappings, providing the mere illusion of choice for the populace. So, finally, towards an ethical money economy. The American journalist and political economist Henry George noticed that land in the center of a large city had a considerably higher value than land in the middle of an empty plain, irrespective of its inherent fertility. He recognized that this added value was a socially generated surplus, a product of the density of the population and the associated facilities and amenities such as schools, libraries, trains, etc., and was in no way due to the efforts of the individual landowner. George saw that the private appropriation of this socially generated surplus, or economic rent, was the reason for the persistence of abject poverty in the midst of plenty in the richest economy in the world. George proposed that a tax on land values to the full extent of the economic rent and the distribution of the proceeds as a universal dividend would be the way to restore socially generated values to society, and that all other taxes should and could be abolished, thereby removing disincentives to creativity and entrepreneurship in the economy. In the 21st century brings the demand for a full tax on economic rent back on the agenda as perhaps the only way to regulate not only land, but the acute problems of scarce resources and environmental destruction. But more importantly, at the start of the 21st century, it is the fiduciary issue in its entirety, the socially generated supplement to the community's wealth, which must be reclaimed for the benefit, indeed the survival, of humanity and social human culture. In a non-pathological economy, the role of the bank is to create units of account and to use these book entries to keep account of transaction events in the real economy in order to inform the decisions of the monetary authority. Confusing the creation of units of account at the stroke of a pen with the making of real money by the sweat of one's brow leads to the perversion of the goods and to the perversion of the monetary representations of those goods, as we have described. It is time the banks made retribution for their accounting error and refilled the metaphorical treasury basement by dumping the mountains of fictitious stock market money into the bottomless hole of fictitious bond market debt to finally settle accounts for creating both of these immortalized fictions for over 300 years. It is also time the human community stopped apologizing for its existence and declared, "We are children of the universe. We have a right to be here." This right to human existence was summed up by Hegel many years ago with his concept of the right to distress. If, for example, it is only by stealing bread, you can see, once we're talking about money, we can never get far from bread. If it's only by stealing bread that the wolf can be kept from the door, the action is, of course, an encroachment on someone's property, but it would be wrong to treat this action as an ordinary theft. To refuse to allow a man in jeopardy of his life to take such steps for self-preservation would be to stigmatize him as without rights, since, as he would be deprived of his life, his freedom would be annulled altogether. While man cannot demand rights from nature, once operating in the symbolic human domain, where value arises gracefully and spontaneously from our simple existence as human beings, this graceful right to have rights must now be embodied in the equitable distribution of the fiduciary issue as positive or ethical money. This lecture, by a theoretical and experimental scientist, ends with a call for a new experiment in economic reality. Is fader ling. Yes, we can. Look beyond the framework of capitalo-parliamentarism to explore a new way of being, a human being. A way of being in which our status is measured by what we are and not by what we have. A way of being that acknowledges that there can be no return to the past with its manic production and manic consumption, and that ecological destruction and resource depletion are not options. A way of living together that emphasizes our considerable sameness rather than our minute differences, in a way that prioritizes the good and banishes once and for all the concept of the original sin of inevitable death. In responding to President Higgins's call to bring ethics into the market square and out of the academic ivory tower and the religious pulpit, this lecture clearly recognizes that the treasuries of scientific truths and religious ethics that have been accumulated over the centuries must be drawn upon to underpin a new universalist egalitarian maxim for a society in which each member has an equal claim to grace, the unearned bounty of human civilization. Taking St. Paul as our guide, we must declare, it is not by work alone that we will be saved, but by grace. Thank you very much.